I canceled my son's mortgage. On the very same night, my wife was called the cleaner. Not because of money, not because of a sudden burst of anger, but because of a moment when I stood in a living room worth over $1 million and watched the woman I married 40 years ago be reduced to something invisible. My son was there, silent, smiling. And in that second I understood a painful paradox. I was the one who built a place where there was no longer room for us. Before I go on, if you're listening to this in a quiet place or during a moment when you need to think, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. It helps me know I'm not telling this story alone. Now, let me tell you why everything began with what seemed like a perfect dinner. That dinner was scheduled more like a performance than a family gathering. Tiffany called it a strategic evening. I called it a Friday night I couldn't refuse. Because Ryan said the investor was important, someone from California, someone who could open new doors for my son's career. The house in the suburbs of Austin was so spotless, it no longer smelled like real life. No old photographs, no trace of time. White walls, soft yellow lighting. Everything placed just right, so no one would ever wonder whether elderly parents had once lived there. I understood the message clearly, even though no one said it out loud. Susan arrived late, not because she was careless. She had just come back from the community garden where she grows vegetables for a senior support program. Her hands still smelled of soil. Dry mud clung to her shoes. She apologized softly, as if her very presence was a mistake in that perfect arrangement. Tiffany saw Susan and paused for a beat. Then she said Susan could stay. No need to change. No need to go to another room. It's fine, she said, her voice light and precise the way you'd straighten a crooked pillow. I didn't understand then. Later I did. She needed Susan exactly where she was. The dinner unfolded exactly as Tiffany intended. The wine was poured, the right kind. The dishes were introduced by their French names. The conversation revolved around projects, personal brands, follower counts. I listened more than I spoke. Ryan spoke just enough to sound confident. Tiffany spoke more, to keep control of the room. Susan quietly stood up and cleared the plates. No one asked her to. No one stopped her. She did it the way she'd done things her whole life, not because she was told to, but because she saw something that needed doing. The investor asked Tiffany, casually pointing towards Susan, "Who is she?" Tiffany smiled. Not loudly, not openly cruel, just enough to freeze the room. She answered with a phrase I had never heard before, but one I will never forget. A way of speaking that turned a person into background, into something that existed only to keep things looking neat. The room went quiet. No one laughed. No one objected. I turned to Ryan. I didn't need a speech. Just one sentence. A frown. Any sign that my son understood where the line was. Ryan smiled. A tight smile. Then he nodded, as if it were harmless humor. He quickly changed the subject, talking about interest rates and expansion plans. Everything kept moving. Only I stood still. I looked at Susan. She said nothing. She didn't cry. She simply bent down and kept wiping the table, as if the words hadn't touched her. I knew what she was doing. She was trying to keep the evening from collapsing. For Ryan, for me, out of a lifelong habit of preserving peace by shrinking herself. I don't remember what I ate. I only remember the weight of every passing minute, as if each second were testing how I would respond. I did nothing, not because I agreed, but because I was watching something else collapse. Slowly, and far more dangerously. I was watching our place in our son's life. When the night ended, Tiffany walked the guests out with her practiced smile. Ryan exchanged polite words. No one mentioned what had happened. Susan picked up her coat. Her hands trembled slightly. I placed my hand on her back. She didn't look at me. She only said she was tired. On the drive home, Susan was silent. So was I. That silence wasn't empty. It was full of things no one wanted to name. When we got home, Susan stayed in the bathroom for a long time. When she came out, her eyes were red. She said she had dropped the soap. I didn't ask anything else. I've lived long enough to know when a question would only cause more harm. That night I lay, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the down payment, about the times I signed papers on Ryan's behalf, about the times I told Susan not to worry, that everything was fine. I thought about how my son had learned that silence can also be a form of agreement. I wasn't angry at Tiffany in the usual way people are angry at someone who insults them. I was angry at how easy it was, how smooth, how familiar, as if Susan's role had been decided long ago, just waiting to be spoken out loud. Near dawn, I heard Susan crying very softly. No sobbing. She didn't call my name, just the sound of someone trying not to break. I sat up, and in that moment I understood that if I stayed silent any longer, I would be the final accomplice. I didn't shout. I didn't make promises. I made one clear decision, cold, final, and impossible to undo, not to punish anyone, but to end a misunderstanding that had gone on far too long, about who was serving whom, and what the true cost of silence really is. The next morning, I didn't tell Susan about my decision, not because I wanted to hide it, but because some things, if spoken too early, lose the precision they require. I simply told her to pack a few outfits. Light, nothing extra. Susan looked at me slightly surprised, but she didn't ask questions. 40 years together was enough for her to know when I had reached a point where there was no more debate. We left the house at 5 a.m. Austin was still dark. The streets were empty. The air was cool and so quiet you could hear the wheels of the suitcase rolling across the concrete. I locked the door slowly out of old habit, then slipped the key into my pocket. Not because I planned to return, but because some doors deserved to be closed properly. The apartment downtown wasn't new. I bought it many years ago, back when I was still traveling often for work, a decision I never mentioned to anyone, not even Ryan. When the elevator opened, Susan stood still for a moment, taking in the empty space, then turned to me. She didn't ask why. She only asked how long we would be staying. I said, "Until things are clear." Susan set the suitcase down and sat in a chair, her hands resting on her knees. She let out a long breath, as if she had finally been given permission to be tired. I made coffee. We didn't speak. We drank it in silence. This silence was different. It wasn't heavy. It felt like a necessary pause before the next step. When Susan went into the bedroom, I opened my laptop. I didn't hesitate. I had prepared myself for this moment the night before. I logged into the bank account that had always been under my name. I looked at the automatic payments appearing month after month. A number I had grown so used to it no longer stirred any feeling. I canceled them, one by one. No rush, no shaking hands. After that, I changed the passwords, not to hide anything, but to reestablish boundaries that had been blurred for far too long. I saved the confirmations, shut the laptop, and sat still for a few minutes. There was no sense of victory, only the feeling that order had been restored to its proper place. That afternoon, I called my lawyer, the man who had handled many things for me over the years, from business contracts to my will. I kept it brief. I didn't recount the dinner. I didn't mention the insult. I only said I wanted to activate an old clause in the financial agreement with my son, a clause written as a safeguard, and never used. He was quiet for a moment, then asked if I was sure. I told him I had never been more certain. He said he would prepare the paperwork. His voice wasn't surprised, just careful, like someone who understands that decisions like this never come from one bad day, but from many years of accumulation. That evening, Susan opened the suitcase to put her things away. As she reorganized her bag, a small notebook fell out. The cover was worn. I recognized it immediately. My old medical records. I was about to pick it up, but Susan reached it first. She flipped through a few pages, stopped, read slowly. I saw her shoulders stiffen. She looked up at me, not angry, not accusing, just stunned. She asked why those checkups had never happened. I sat down across from her. I didn't avoid her gaze. I told her about Ryan's debt, about a failed business venture I had quietly cleaned up, about postponing my own care to patch the holes my son wasn't strong enough to face. I spoke the way one delivers a report, without emotion, because the emotion had been processed long ago. Susan didn't speak right away. She closed the notebook and placed it on the table. Then she cried, silently, tears falling in a steady line. She said she wasn't angry at me. She just couldn't understand how that kind of sacrifice had been treated as something so small. I didn't answer, because I was asking myself the same question. When she calmed down, I told her I wouldn't let it happen again. Not with promises, but with action. I said there are things that, if left in place, slowly corrode everything around them, even the best parts. Susan nodded. This time she looked straight at me. No more turning away. 3 days later, my phone rang. I knew it would. Ryan's voice came through, rushed, unable to steady itself. He said the bank kept calling, said there was a problem with the payments, said everything was becoming a mess. He asked me what I had done. I didn't give a long explanation. I only said that I had stopped. Ryan was silent for a few seconds, then his voice shifted into accusation. He said I was destroying his life. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he asked if I understood the consequences, I told him I understood them very well, because I had been carrying them for years. I ended the call, not because I had nothing left to say, but because that conversation needed to end there. Susan stood near the window, hearing enough to understand. She didn't ask if I regretted it. She only asked if I was okay. I said I was. And this time, it was true. That night I received a message saying Ryan and Tiffany wanted to meet. I didn't refuse. I knew the next confrontation was unavoidable. But I also knew that since the morning we left, everything had already begun to shift, and no longer in their direction. Ryan and Tiffany arrived the following afternoon. I didn't ask what time they were coming. I didn't prepare anything beyond clearing the coffee table, not to host guests, but to make sure nothing stood in the way of what needed to be laid out. When the doorbell rang, Susan stood up first. I gently held her hand, not firmly, just enough for her to understand that this time I would open the door. Ryan stood in front, his face tight, his jacket still on. Tiffany stood behind him, perfectly made up her eyes, moving quickly, measuring the space. They stepped inside, looked around, said nothing for the first few seconds. I invited them to sit, not warmly, not coldly, just appropriately. Ryan spoke first, his voice rushed. He said there must be a misunderstanding, said the interrupted payments had caused serious trouble, said the bank doesn't wait for anyone. Tiffany followed more gently. She spoke as if calming a minor family issue. She called it a slip of the tongue. Said everyone says the wrong thing sometimes. That one evening shouldn't push everything out of control. I listened. I let them finish. When they stopped, I pointed toward Susan. She sat still, hands on her lap, back straight. I spoke slowly, word by word, and said that the slip of the tongue had made my wife cry, and that there are tears that cannot be erased by late apologies. I placed the medical notebook on the table. Then the legal folders. I didn't explain every page. I didn't need to. I simply said the price of that joke wasn't a moment of hurt feelings. It was the entire foundation they were standing on. Ryan looked down. Tiffany looked at me, her expression changing. The softness disappeared. She asked if I planned to use money to control them. I told her I had used money to protect them for far too long, to the point that I forgot to protect myself and the woman sitting beside me. The air in the room grew heavier. I stood up, walked to the cabinet, and brought back another stack of papers. I said that while they were busy maintaining a perfect image, I had taken time to review everything. Late payments. Ignored bills. I spoke about the car they were driving. About the items in the house that I had once believed were fully paid for. Tiffany interrupted me. She said that was private. I looked straight at her and said, nothing is private when it's built on someone else's resources. I told her I had called her parents that morning, not to accuse, just to confirm one thing, and that thing was now clear. She went quiet. Ryan looked up, confusion in his eyes, something I had never seen in my son before. I continued without raising my voice. I said they had been living in a house under my name, using guarantees I provided to build an image they believed was solid. Tiffany jumped to her feet. She said I was destroying her career, that everything she had built online would collapse without that house. I listened. I didn't argue. I only said that a career built on the disregard of others was already standing on weak ground. Ryan said nothing. My son sat there, hands clasped together as if trying to hold on to something that no longer had shape. I looked at him and realized that for the first time in many years, I no longer felt the need to shield him. I handed them the final folder, the house sale documents. I told them they had 30 days. No threats, no negotiation, just information. Tiffany gave a strained laugh and said, I couldn't do that. I said, I already had. They left faster than they arrived. No goodbye. No looking back. The room fell silent again. Susan exhaled, as if she had been holding her breath the entire time. She asked if I was sure. I told her I had been sure since the moment I saw her standing at the sink that night. That evening I sat alone. Susan went to bed early. I didn't sleep right away. I thought about Ryan as a child. about teaching him how to drive, about the way he once looked at me with complete trust. I didn't deny the sense of loss, but I didn't turn back. The days that followed moved faster than I expected. News spread within their circle, not from me. I didn't need to say anything. When a structure built on image begins to crack, it makes its own noise. I received a few calls. Some checking in, some keeping their distance. I answered just enough. I wasn't looking for agreement. I was holding on to the calm that had just returned. One morning Susan made coffee and said she felt lighter, not happy, not excited, just lighter. I nodded. So did I. We sat by the window, watching the city wake up. I thought that maybe for the first time in many years we were living in a space where we didn't have to prove anything to anyone. I know it isn't over. Real consequences often arrive later. But I also know that from the moment I placed those folders on the table, another door opened. Not loudly, not brilliantly, but wide enough for me to step forward, without carrying the feeling that I was standing in the wrong place in my own life. After that meeting, I didn't feel relief right away. The quiet that returned to the apartment didn't feel like a reward. It felt more like an empty space that needed to be filled with something real. Susan kept her routines. She tended the plants on the small balcony, called her friends from the community garden, cooked as if we were only here temporarily. But I knew we couldn't go back to the old rhythm. One door had closed, and behind it were questions with no answers yet. A few days later, I drove alone. I didn't tell Susan where I was going. I needed space to think, and I needed to see someone who had been gone from my life for far too long. Arthur, my older brother, lives in the mountains near Asheville. We hadn't spoken in 20 years. Ever since a family conflict, we both chose to bury in silence instead of resolving. I didn't know if he would want to see me, but I knew that if I didn't go, I'd keep carrying the feeling that I had missed something important. The road into the mountains twisted and climbed. The farther I went, the weaker the phone signal became. That made it easier to breathe. When I arrived, Arthur was outside repairing a wooden frame. He had aged. So had I. We stood there for a moment, no hug, no handshake. Finally, he nodded, as if he'd been expecting me all along. We sat on the porch. I told him everything, no details left out, no attempts to justify myself. I told him about the dinner, about Susan, about Ryan, about cutting things off. Arthur listened. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said one thing that made me sit up straight. He said I hadn't been carrying everything alone the way I thought. 10 years earlier, when Ryan had gotten into serious trouble with business debt, Arthur had quietly paid most of it off. He never told me because he knew I would refuse. He said he didn't want me choosing between my son and my health. I looked at him. I thought about all the checkups I had postponed, about the constant exhaustion I had brushed aside, and I realized that while I believed I was sacrificing myself alone, someone else had been standing behind me silently, keeping me from falling. Arthur didn't blame me for cutting ties with Ryan. He only said that sometimes the people we hold on to the tightest are the ones who push us farthest away. And sometimes real family isn't loud. It doesn't demand. It doesn't need recognition. That night, I stayed at Arthur's place. We ate a simple dinner. No wine. No revisiting old wounds. We talked about his work, about small community projects he was building. Spaces for artists, for craftspeople, for people who wanted to work with their hands and slow their lives down. I listened and realized it was exactly what Susan had been searching for, even if she'd never put words to it. The next morning, Arthur took me out to the land behind his house. Wide, quiet, an old workshop, plenty of natural light. He said he'd been thinking about expanding the place for a long time, but didn't want to do it alone. He asked if Susan and I would consider coming here. Not as guests, but as partners in building something. He said he would cover the remaining financial side for us, not as a loan, but as timely support. He said what he needed wasn't money, but someone who understood the value of creating something useful for others. I drove back to Austin in silence. When I told Susan, she didn't react right away. She sat still, her hand resting on a cup of tea gone cold. Then she asked if Arthur had a garden. I nodded. She smiled softly. For the first time in days, I saw her eyes without that guarded look. We talked it through. No rush. No dreaming. Just practical questions. About life. About age. about how starting again doesn't mean returning to zero. It means shifting into a different form. During that time, Ryan didn't reach out. I didn't go looking for him, not because I didn't care, but because I knew that if there was still something he wanted from me, it wouldn't be my presence. It would be something else, and I was no longer in a position to provide that. When we decided to leave Austin, I didn't feel like I was running away. I felt like I was moving forward, not toward something perfect, but toward something more honest. Arthur called it building. I called it repairing. On our last evening in the apartment, Susan stood on the balcony, looking out at the city. She said she didn't hate this place. She just didn't belong to it. I understood. Some places don't push you away, but they don't hold you either. Some relationships are the same. When we locked the door for the final time, I didn't look back. Not because I felt nothing, but because I had learned that some turning points in life don't need regret. They only need clarity. We arrived in Asheville on a foggy morning. There was no dramatic sense of starting over. Just a quiet shift, like setting down a suitcase you've been carrying for too long. Arthur was already there. He didn't say much. He opened the gate, showed Susan the path to the garden out back where the soil was still damp and the air was calm. I watched her kneel down, press her hand into the earth, and I knew I had brought her to the right place. The first months moved slowly. No grand plans, no announcements. We cleared out the old wood shop, fixed the roof, opened the windows so daylight could stay longer during the day. Susan began planting, not to sell anything, just to watch something grow steadily. I helped Arthur organize small gatherings for people in the area. Woodworkers, artists, people who had retired early and were looking for a way to use their time for something meaningful. We called it the Miller Workshop, not to build a name, just to remind ourselves that everything here was made by hand, with time and with mutual respect. Susan worked with soil and color. I worked with schedules and stories. I shared what I knew, how to keep discipline, how not to trade integrity for convenience, how to recognize when it's time to stop. Meanwhile, the house in Austin was sold. I wasn't involved in the process. The lawyer handled it. I only received the final report. Short, clean. Ryan and Tiffany moved out. Into a smaller place farther from the center. I wasn't happy to hear it. I wasn't sad either. I simply noted it, the way you notice a change in the weather. I sent Ryan a check, just enough to cover 3 months of rent. No more, no conditions. Along with a single handwritten line, "This is the last help you'll receive from me. From here on, you clean up your own life." I didn't reuse old language. I didn't need to. The meaning was clear. Ryan didn't reply. I didn't expect him to. Some lessons can't be taught with words. They only appear when there's no one left to catch you. Life in Asheville isn't perfect. There are long stretches of rain. There are mornings when I wake up tired. But unlike before, I don't ignore it. I go for regular checkups, Susan reminds me. I listen, not out of fear, but because I no longer need to prove that I can endure more. One afternoon, I sat in the workshop, writing the final lines of this story. In front of me was a small glass jar filled with soil from Susan's garden. I held it in my hand, felt the real weight of something once considered dirty, invisible. They called my wife the cleaner, because all they ever saw was dust. They never saw the seeds she was planting. Quietly, patiently. I didn't just stop a payment. I closed an old loop, one where sacrifice was treated as something automatic. I chose to turn assets into resources, and silence into boundaries. Susan walked into the workshop. She placed her hand on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. We stood there together, watching people work, talk, laugh softly. No one here needs a role to play. No one needs to feel taller by making someone else smaller. If there's one thing I've learned through all of this, it's this family is not a place where you're asked to shrink so others can look bigger. And fairness doesn't always come from demanding it. Sometimes it comes from knowing when to walk away. This is our next chapter. Not loud, not perfect, but quiet enough for us to know that finally, we're living where we belong. If you stayed until the final moments of this story, I truly appreciate that. If it made you think about boundaries, about family, or about the value of respect, please tap like to support, subscribe so you don't miss the next stories, and share it if you think someone else needs to hear this. Thank you for listening all the way through. Your presence is what gives stories like this their meaning.